swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and
the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor, could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
I am Jonathan Stafford in Van Tam.
Professor, thank you very much for attending today and for your continued assistance, in particular the provision of a further statement, INQ 000474404 of the 7th of October last year, running to 79 pages. Professor, I'm going to, well, I hope I won't embarrass you, but I'm just going to summarise briefly your professional qualifications and your experience, because, of course, it all goes to the issues on which we'll be asking you for your views on in a moment. But you are, by training profession, an epidemiologist and physician in public health. You have a significant number of degrees, diplomas, doctorates and fellowships. You were head of the Pandemic Influenza Office of what was then the Health Protection Agency Centre in Colindale. You were, importantly, a member of the old SPI committee, which we looked at in Module 1, a member of SAGE during the swine flu pandemic. You chaired the expert advisory group on H5N1 bird flu. You were the chair of NerveTag between 2014 and 17, and then, of course, you were appointed Deputy Chief Medical Officer in October 17, and you remained in that post until March 22. And you're a published author and senior editor, and you've had more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers published. Did you work as a vaccinator also during the course of the pandemic?
Yes, I did.
Did you do half a day a week, I think, on a
I
shift?
did half a day a week, and it was a great relief to be out of Whitehall and Westminster with normal people for a while.
The role of the Office of the Chief Medical Officer and the role of the DCMO alongside the CMO is a most important one in the context of this pandemic. Could we just have up, please, paragraph 1.7 of INQ 000474404? Thank you very much. The heart of your role during the pandemic was you were at the interface, if you like, between those bodies concerned in policy, the government and the government's chief scientific advisor, development, UKVN, the UK Vaccine Network, of which we've heard, and KEPI, the clinical trials and studies of which we've heard, their funding, which was the responsibility of the NHIR, UKRI, and its MRC, the Medical Research Council, procurement, the VTF, the Vaccine Task Force, the TTF, the ATF, and the ATTF, and prioritization and delivery, because you were an observer at the JCVI, and of course you were closely connected to the other CMOs and the NHS, England, and the public health agencies concerned in delivery. So you were in rather a unique spot, the interface between all these various moving parts. Did you also attend, observe at, or liaise with numerous advisory groups, such as the NerveTag COVID-19 Therapeutics Subcommittee, the Neutralizing Monoclonal Antibodies and Antivirals Access Independent Advisory Group, the Prophylaxis Oversight Group, Rapid C19 Committee, and so on?
Yes, I did, but the pressure on my time was really so great that it wasn't possible to religiously attend all of those meetings. And in truth, with the passage of time, I really can't recall a great deal of it. But it was my job to, I suppose, be the oil in the machinery and to try and plot out for the CMO and for ministers and understand what was happening in these various domains, some of which, of course, like the MHRA, were entirely independent in terms of the decisions they took.
Indeed. But the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, that's say Professor Whitty, yourself, and Professor Harris, were to a very large extent the oil in the machine. You had a rather unique position whereby you saw what was going on at every level of the pandemic response.
Yes. Yes, and I think we also had to be, in many cases, the translator interfaces between different bits of science, different types of science, and between the policy making and the political world.
And the CMO and the DCMO or the CMO and the DCMOs are entirely independent, are they not?
The Office of the Chief Medical Officer, that function is by statute independent. Professor Sir Chris was always my boss, and I wouldn't have considered myself to be able to act entirely independently of Chris. In any line management structure, there's always a boss. But equally, Sir Chris was always extremely accepting of good scientific arguments, whoever they came from.
And so at every level, the proprieties were always observed in terms of the independence of the various bodies. If you could have up 000071697. By way of an example, Professor, on the 17th of November, you yourself wrote to Dr. Rain, now Dame June Rain, head of the MHRA. We can see from the third paragraph, the department, the DHSE, wishes to supply this vaccine, this is a reference to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore seek your views on its suitability for temporary authorization under Regulation 174, so that we may promptly and safely deploy the vaccine. If we just go to the end of the letter, we'll see your name on the left-hand side. There we are. As with many other parts of the complex machinery, it was very important, wasn't it, to preserve the independence of the various bodies. So you were formally here asking the MHRA to consider its position, but only on authorization, which was exclusively for the MHRA. And you refer to the advice, which, whilst relevant, is not the same thing as authorization from the JCVI.
Indeed so, yeah.
Right.
And, for the record, and I hope she won't mind me being colloquial, I lost count of the number of times I would have had a telephone call with Dame June and said, June, at all times, if you think I or anybody else in the wider system is, nudging you or treading on your toes in some way, put the phone down and complain about it, because it's absolutely sacrosanct and importantly so that your work remains independent.
And indeed, on the 16th of November, by way again of example only, 71886, INQ 000-71886. Here's a letter, in fact, from Sir Chris Whitty, copied to Sir Patrick Vallance as he then was, saying exactly that.
Yep.
You've got to preserve your independence, and if you need help in preserving your independence, please let us know. And so that we're absolutely clear, decisions on authorization were absolutely and exclusively for the MHRA. Decisions on procurement were for ministers on advice of the various task forces, but in particular the vaccine task force, and following advice from the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, Treasury, and no doubt anybody else with a view on matters. And decisions around vaccine eligibility and prioritization, again, were for ministers, but on the advice which they agreed to take and accept in advance of the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation.
Yes, that is entirely correct. But I wouldn't want to give the impression that VTF and then subsequent ministerial approval of procurement decisions were made in a vacuum, without advice from the VTF clinical advisor, which was me, in relation to the likely number of vaccines that would be needed, for example.
Yes, indeed.
And I, in a way, had to kind of second guess where I thought the JCVI discussions were going, because the JCVI couldn't make a decision until there were vaccines, but equally we had to buy things early on that didn't exist. We were putting money behind contracts in the hope that there would be a vaccine. But, you have to decide whether you want 30 million doses or 60 million doses, and you can't do that in a vacuum. So, absolutely, I gave that
That's
advice.
an important topic. And in fact, either yourself or Secretary or often all of you, including your fellow Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harris, gave advice in relation to the purchasing of vaccines and therapeutics, the prioritization and eligibility for therapeutics and the offering of vaccination, as well as we'll see, dealing with a multitude of issues concerning vaccine confidence or hesitancy, delivery, take-up, the whole gamut.
Yep.
Right. Vaccine development. It is very clear from evidence before this inquiry, in particular from Module 1, that pre-2020, the majority of government effort and resources was focused on the possibility of a flu pandemic.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions about onshore manufacturing capability in a moment and on research and development. But in a very general sense, do you think that the United Kingdom was well prepared for what is known as disease X, that is to say, the yet unnamed but likely to happen prospective or future pathogenic outbreak?
So the answer to that is, I think, in two parts.
Please.
Part one, that I think I agree with what the inquiry has already said, that there was a very substantial focus on pandemic influenza as the threat, perhaps the only threat, and there hadn't been that diversity of thinking to the same extent about other pathogens, in other words, a disease X such as COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. Equally, I would say now that my personal scientific view is that a future pandemic is a racing certainty, and by far and away the most likely pathogen to give us the next pandemic, based on probability and the number of data points we have, which are small, is influenza. So in a way, that was and should have been the primary focus, because for me it still remains the most likely next pandemic threat, though you make those kind of predictions, you can always be wrong.
Of course, we were hit by coronavirus in 2020. What do you say to the opinion of many people, which is that attention must also be paid to the disease X on the premise that it's not flu?
Yes, I agree with that. And the WHO has a list of high priority pathogens. I think we should take note of that.
You were intimately involved in the process by which vaccines were successfully identified, procured and delivered. And I just want to look at the position that prevailed on the cusp of the pandemic in January 2020, so that we can see just how unlikely it was that a vaccine would successfully be developed and manufactured. Could we have 4747554, page 1? This is a note you did for ministers dated the 24th of January on coronavirus. And you make it absolutely plain there are no vaccines available for the Wuhan, it was then known as the Wuhan coronavirus virus. A vaccine is unlikely to be available for at least 12 months, even in experimental or unlicensed form, and probably far longer. There has been considerable research done already and a lot of funding already provided, so the United Kingdom is in a good position. But the likelihood of successful development and manufacture was relatively low.
Yes, I think we all felt it was relatively low at the time. I would say that if you asked me the same question again now, knowing what I know about the messenger RNA platform technology that we did not know in 2020, it is clearly very agile. In essence, and I'm oversimplifying, once you have the genetic sequence of the new organism, you can almost dial up a candidate vaccine. So that kind of time frame that I gave then was right at the time. We could be a bit more optimistic for the future.
Right.
I think particularly with the agility that the messenger RNA platform is likely, though unproven, to give us against other future pandemic pathogens.
Had there been some, well, there have been a few advance, there have been some advance and considerable amount of research done on mRNA vaccines pre-2020, I think in the context of the possibility of using them to battle cancer, is that correct?
Science has been working on the idea that messenger RNAs could be used in vaccine form for about 20 years
Right.
Prior to the emergence of the pandemic. So, we shouldn't believe that these things just appeared in a puff of smoke in early 2020. They were actually the efforts of scientists over 20 years that were just about mature enough to give us a solution at that time. But let's be clear, if the pandemic had happened in 2015, I don't think the messenger RNA platform technology could have come to our assistance in the way that it did in 2020.
There's much material before my lady which suggests that one of the many reasons in the complex picture of why there are degrees of vaccine hesitancy or lack of confidence is the notion that the vaccines were built on technology that was entirely new, untested, appeared as if by magic in this country and other countries in 2020. So I want you to be clear, the mRNA technology had been worked on for a number of years beforehand,
Yes.
had also the vaccine vector technology, the use of the adenoviral vector,
Yes.
the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine also been worked on and been around for some time.
That had also been worked on for many years, and indeed, as Sir Chris referred to this morning, the funding in 2016, I recall, from UKVN to help the Oxford Vaccine Group take the adenovirus vector technology towards I think it was a MERS vaccine, really gave them a head start in 2020.
And you are aware, of course, that the United Kingdom government, through a number of bodies, but not least UKRI and the NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, had funded to a very significant extent different teams of researchers and investigators working on vaccines. For example, the Oxford Group, as also with the team led by Robin Shattuck at Imperial College London.
Yes.
Could we have 00004760, please? This is another document you prepared in those very difficult days in January 2020 about the way forward. And you were asked to consider how vaccine discovery might be accelerated. And you set out what you openly described as the difficult picture, which is that a new vaccine often requires 15 to 20 years, financial resources upward of $1 billion to reach licensing. There are obvious complexities and the passage of time in both the preclinical and the clinical stages. If you could go over the page to page 2, paragraphs 18 onwards, you set out there some of the existing research, and you've just referred to MERS. And you identify a number of vaccine candidates. So the picture wasn't one of unalloyed gloom, as you say. A lot of research had been done, and a significant degree of progress had already been made. But it was a question of building on all that in order to be able to reach the promised land.
It was, and for the Vaccine Task Force, literally, the Vaccine Task Force had to back multiple technologies in order to have the chance of at least one winner. So it was a form of spread betting by any other name. But it was necessary, and indeed all of the modalities that the Vaccine Task Force backed have now produced licensed vaccines for COVID-19 somewhere in the world. So it was
a great success.
It was good hunting in terms of my colleagues and not myself, who did the really hard due diligence work to pick out not necessarily the most kind of perfect appealing science, but the science that looked good and had a realistic prospect of delivery within, shall we say, 18 months to 24 months.
If we could go forward one page to page 4, please, paragraph 35. You identify a number of actions which you believe should be taken proactively to prepare for the possible arrival of the virus and for domestic preparedness. You refer to the very good regulatory environment. I won't ask you questions about that, but was that a reference to the MHRA in particular and its scrupulous independence and exclusive control over the issue of authorization? And then over the page, strong facilities for phase 1 trials. 3, the continued development of vaccine candidates, so looking for the spread betting approach. 4, whether the UK should invest in nucleic acid manufacturing facilities for mRNA vaccines. So right at the beginning, you were seeking to identify ways in which the United Kingdom could get ahead of the game, try to increase the prospects of a successful development and production of a vaccine.
Yeah, it was clearly the number one priority for us, and it was my personal number one priority, because I couldn't see a way of normalising our lives quicker than by having a vaccine solution at population level.
In this general scheme, Professor, why is the ability to offer strong trial facilities to a prospective manufacturer of such importance?
Well, there's always this counter-argument, if you like, that so long as somebody offers a manufacturer good phase 1 facilities, and so long as they bring a vaccine to license, you can buy it later, as it were. However, there is a kind of soft diplomacy that goes with helping pharmaceutical and vaccine companies to do their work on our behalf to develop new vaccines. And it is often the case that where you are, as a country deeply involved in supporting vaccine manufacture, you are in a better position in terms of access to vaccine as quickly as possible. So there's part of this is about building on the evident strength of British bioscience, but equally it's about a kind of soft diplomacy in terms of being front and centre when it comes to access to vaccines.
So in addition to having a manufacturing capability, it's perhaps no less important to have a strong platform for the carrying out of trials, so that as a country we can be regarded as a best client, a best purchaser.
Yeah.
And that's a process which, of course, is required to be funded.
Indeed. It is about, with all the safeguards of propriety and independence in place, it is about developing the best possible supportive relationship on an ongoing basis with the industry, who, in my view, have always been instrumental in delivering us vaccine solutions at scale when we need them. But it's about that partnership approach with the proper respect for firewalls and integrity and commercial sensitivity.
On the 30th of March 2020, you personally and Sir Patrick Vallance, as he then was, the government's chief scientific advisor, signed off the objectives. You identified and elucidated the objectives for the vaccine task force.
Yeah.
And the vaccine task force, as is very well known, commenced in two parts. It had an external advisory board and a program board, and the external advisory board had bio-industrial specialists and venture capitalists, vaccine scientists, a lot of external element. And that became the vaccine task force, chaired by Dame Kate Bingham, and led by the Director General of that task force, Nick Elliott. In your statement, you say, however, that as a result of the constitution and the development of that very successful body, you were struck by what you saw as the dysfunctional relationship between the civil service and pharmaceutical industry, and you appeal for the most effective working relationship that is possible to be pursued. And you also suggest that there be in the future the creation of a totally dedicated workforce instrumental to the recreation of that vaccine success. Why couldn't, in your view, a normal government department, just an existing part of the DHSC or BEIS, BAYS, have done what the Vaccine Task Force did? Why do you think it succeeded?
So let me go back to my original remark, which I want to be interpreted in terms of prior to the VTF, the relationship between the civil service and the pharmaceutical industry was a bit dysfunctional, as I observed it. It was just too formal, too standoffish, and there wasn't this willingness to kind of, behave as close colleagues and share problems and find solutions. It was all a bit too kind of stultified in some way. What changed with the Vaccine Task Force was partly that Dame Kate recruited a lot of people from the industry who had a different kind of mindset, and it was very helpful to me to have worked in the pharmaceutical and the vaccine industries to understand that difference in mindset. But also it was a national emergency, and it was brought with a very specific, almost task and finish approach to get this job done, because people were dying and we had to put the brakes on that. And therefore the kind of mission focus of the individuals within the Vaccine Task Force was something that I've never seen before, and I'm immensely privileged to have been a part of that.
Would you therefore recommend, with all the authority you could muster, that if faced with a similar national emergency in the future, the same, it's an excellent phrase if I may say so, task and finish approach is adopted?
Well, I think the answer, broadly speaking, is yes, but the important bits are the mindset, and the important bits are also being able to bring together the right people as quickly as possible, even quicker than was done in 2020. So I think there is an argument. In the military there are rapid reaction units who are held at readiness from anything from 2 hours upwards to a month. But those units know they have a kind of stand-up role if there's a problem. I think we almost need a cadre of experts who understand that they are on kind of, call down, as it were, in case there's a problem. We don't want to be looking for those in the heat of a crisis. We ought to know who they are. We ought to manage the membership, and it'll churn over time as people retire, new people come along. So I think there's some argument in that, but the most important thing is not what you call it. The most important thing is the mindset.
I know we're here in the hearing room this morning when Professor Whitty was giving evidence, and at one stage he said something I personally have always believed: it's not so much the structures as the personalities. And you obviously had in Dame Kate Bingham a personality who was determined to get things done. If you had this cadre of experts, would it not depend upon whoever in an emergency was in overall charge to get things done and to change the mindset?
Yes, it would, and I wouldn't want to predefine that for the future too much, but I think I would say, and I have said it publicly on many lectures that I've given, that I think it was a stroke of genius to have a venture capitalist who understood biotechnology at the heart of moving at pace to bring science to the marketplace, as it were. I think that was an inspired choice. Of course, you're right, a lot of it had to do with Dame Kate's personal characteristics and how driven we all know that she is and she was, but equally it was an inspired occupational choice in my view.
And we're not calling him as a witness, and therefore I hope I can say this without causing him undue embarrassment, that choice was in large part down to the judgment of Sir Patrick Vallance, as he then was. And it's important, I think, also to note that the External Advisory Board, that part of the Vaccine Task Force in its original emanation, was chaired by Sir Patrick Vallance, and also that the notion of the Vaccine Task Force in its final form was significantly contributed to by Alex Jones of Bayes,
yes,
witness from whom we heard earlier. Before I ask you for your overarching recommendations on this in this field, can I ask you a couple of questions, please, about VMIC, the Vaccine Manufacturing Innovation Centre? Mm-hmm. It's obvious from the emails and the submissions put to ministers and the paperwork before the inquiry that by January 2021, it was obvious that hundreds of millions of pounds had already been spent by way of funding on the centre, and there was a request for a further 80 million. But that there were cost overruns and a slow delivery. The site was effectively it hadn't been developed to the extent that it was wished it would be. And there was a prospect of a sale and a risk, in fact, the site would become unused or broken up. And I think the view was taken that the best option to try to get the site completed and get the site operational would be to sell the entity to a foreign multinational that could recapitalise the project. Did you have any views yourself on the merits of the sale of VMIC to Catalent?
I didn't have any specific views on the sale of VMIC to Catalent, other than I understood them to be a contract manufacturing organisation, and it was a sensible sale. But I inherited the VMIC concept, if you like, and it was introduced to me when I was in office. It was either the late part of 2017 or early 2018. And I think I probably didn't make many friends with my VMIC colleagues because I was a bit unenthusiastic about the whole thing. And I realise I may be at variance with other, super scientific experts, but my view is that VMIC was tending towards the idea of a state-owned solution for pandemic vaccine manufacture, and I haven't seen that work outside of, the more totalitarian schemes of the world. In the Western world, it has always been about the vaccine industry being able to deliver a pandemic vaccine at scale, as was the case in 2009. And so for me, the kind of approach that I think is more important is onshoring and backing vaccine manufacturers to do their work and keep a plant warm lit in the UK through their normal routes of business, but to have step-in rights in the case of a pandemic. And
by step-in rights, do you mean an ability on the part of the government to say, right, you are turning the entirety of your manufacturing processes to creating manufacturing a vaccine for us?
And we're probably getting into detail here that I don't think I'm qualified to talk about.
Just in a general sense, you've used the phrase step in,
yes,
step
so
up.
Step in could be about make the vaccine for us, but the whole world needs a pandemic vaccine when there's a pandemic. But it could also be about priority access.
All right.
And so there are different degrees of how you step in, and that's not for me to...
But you'd like to see a number of manufacturing plants owned by manufacturers, but in relation to which the government has the ability to turn the production towards their own use.
So I think it's potentially a very big advance that the UK government now has a partnership deal with a messenger RNA manufacturer. I am agnostic.
Do you mean the Moderna deal?
And I'm agnostic to which messenger RNA manufacturer it is, so long as they manufacture messenger RNA vaccines. But equally, it is a case in point that the vast majority of the vaccines we use in day-to-day public health practice are protein subunit vaccines, and I think we ought to think seriously about onshoring protein subunit manufacture in the UK as well.
Would what you say apply equally, Professor, to factories for the production of antibodies, and also factories for what is called fill and finish, the sort of syringes, yes, the vials, the adjuvants, the bits and pieces that go with a vaccine?
So with respect, the consumables are the vaccines and the needles and so forth, and the sharp spins, and you do need those in very large quantities in order to do a national vaccine campaign, as we did. And one of the detailed conversations I remember having with the procurement people was about making sure that we had however many tens of millions of syringes bought before they came into short supply, and that we made sure that the graduations on the side could cope with a 0.3 or a 0.5 ml administration, because you can get some that just go 0.5 milady, and that would be guesswork then for the 0.3. So there was a lot of work went into consumables, but in terms of fill and finish, that is really what I suppose in common parlance we would call the kind of canning and bottling bit of vaccine manufacture. And for that you need a line that has able to move at very high speed and fill vials. You need all the glass, the medical grade glass that goes with the vials. It is internationally in very short supply. And so, yes, that is often the bottleneck for any vaccine manufacturer.
And you were intimately concerned, in fact, with trying to release that bottleneck in the course of the pandemic. So to summarise and to draw those threads together, Professor, do you advocate for a cadre, as you've described it, a national vaccine committee or cohort, not necessarily a statutory agency, to be concerned with everything to do with vaccines, from surveillance to research and development to procurement, to the point, in fact, of national delivery, in order to be able to replicate what the VTF did, but also to give them a wider reach in terms of surveillance and research and development?
No, I really don't want to go as wide as surveillance, which is done very well and by the UKHSA, and really to the envy of many people across Europe and the world.
Right.
So
not surveillance.
I think it's about understanding the cadre of people that you are going to bring in if there is a need to move at real speed in this area.
Right. So, to a very large extent, reflective of what was and what became the Vaccine Task Force.
Yes.
Thank you. Secondly, do you call for further research and development in relation to vaccine technology, but particularly to try to see whether it's possible to identify a generic or a prototype vaccine that can be tailored towards the particular pathogenic outbreak?
So I think that's a very, very deep question, because vaccine development is so expensive. You can't take every potential human pathogen on the planet and necessarily have the resources to make a vaccine prototype, but you can do things such as the UK government has done very recently. I'm not close to the details, only what's been released in the public domain, but with the continued advance of H5N1, for example, in dairy herds in the UK, in the US, the UK, I gather, has made a decision to procure in advance for stockpiling several million doses of H5N1 vaccine. That is the kind of measured, proportionate step commensurate with changing risk that the US BARDA organisation has been doing for years and years. And
Right.
It is something that we could do, but I want to be clear, I have great admiration for a senior military officer who said to me, the public need to understand that freedom is not free. And in the same way, vaccine pandemic preparedness is not free. It is very expensive.
That's very clear, thank you. And then thirdly, finally, based on what you've said, you call for a resilient onshore vaccine and antibody manufacturing capability.
Vaccines.
Thank you. Could we now address, please, some of the discrete issues, and only some of them, which were considered by yourself and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer during the course of the pandemic? The dosage interval was an issue on which you were asked to advise. You wrote, along with Antonia Williams of the DHSC, to the MHRA on the 22nd of December 2020, pointing out that, of course, the new, I think it was the Alpha strain, had arisen and was becoming dominant. COVID-19 was on the increase. You asked the MHRA expert working group, because it had a number of working groups, and also the Committee for Human Medicines, to provide a steer as to whether or not the interval between dose 1 and dose 2 could be extended. Briefly, what would be the prospective advantage of extending the interval?
On theoretical grounds, if you give one dose of vaccine time to mature in the human immune system, it's going to respond better to the second dose. There was some very persuasive early data from the Siren study showing that in healthcare workers, those who had the longest interval between doses had the highest protection against infection. And so I say that in a theoretical world where, for example, if February now and January now, if we could predict there was going to be a pandemic in 2026 and we could make the vaccine now and we could offer vaccine to the UK population in advance of that, my vote would be for an interval between the doses of at least 3 months. So that was the kind of theoretical basis for it. The hard-nosed reality at the time was that although we had very substantial contracts for vaccine futures, if that's the right word,
Supply was still tight.
the rate at which it was coming through was not high to begin with, and we were faced with a difficult choice of whether to fully vaccinate a smaller number of people or to first dose very many more. And you know, it was controversial, and I remember the fan mail, if that's the right word, in my inbox at the time from public and the medical community about this.
And I want to be clear, there were people all around the world who said, well, why are you doing this? But you were right, were you not? Because the degree of protection given by the first dose, if prioritised, allowed a larger number of people.
We didn't do this. We didn't do this in a vacuum in terms of, you know, let's just guess that the protection from the first dose was this much. We actually had a bit of data coming through on that, and the modelers helped us with it. And I believe in the fullness of time, the World Health Organization, which had been in opposition to our position, came round and agreed it was the right thing to do.
And your colleague, Sir Chris Whitty, together with the other UK CMOs, all wrote a letter of advice on the 30th of December on this issue of the dosing schedule. And I'm going to summarise it, if I may, Professor. I hope you'll forgive me in this phrase. It's better to give 2 grandparents 89% protection than to give one 95% protection and the other one none at all.
Did I say that?
You did.
Yes. And
you said it in the Daily Mail on the 3rd of January, so I'm presuming that is the correct
and I presume,
summation.
well, I wouldn't have put it in the Daily Mail, those figures, unless I'd actually substantiated them with data. So, yeah.
And another deeply contentious issue was the issue of vaccination as a condition of deployment.
Yes.
Which is the policy by which one may mandate that if one is to be deployed in a patient-facing role, for example, then one must be vaccinated. You were very closely connected to the debate in February and March 2020 as to whether or not the coronavirus bill, which was then passing through Parliament, should include a mandatory vaccination provision for both COVID and flu. Is that correct? Did that come to pass? Was there a provision made in the Act for mandatory vaccination for COVID and flu?
I can't remember, to be truthful.
Will you take it from me that there wasn't?
I think it was withdrawn.
You wrote on the
And I
5th of
think-
March saying, I think we can let this one drop.
Yeah, right.
So I think not.
Yeah.
Right.
I think where I felt I'd got a contribution to make was that I had been studying academically influenza vaccination in healthcare workers for many years, and indeed had advised the WHO prior to being DCMO on this subject. And I was kind of very clear on where the evidence was, but also where the evidence ended in terms of mainly the US, mainly hospitals, and the mandation as a condition of employment in various private hospitals in the US. And I understood where that had been studied and what the data readout was. And I felt that was important, that that was on the table for ministers to understand as part of what was absolutely their decision.
It was a political decision, in truth.
Absolutely.
You were sent a copy of a paper that had been prepared for the committee, which my lady will remember well, COVID-O, which was then in play. This was in June 2021. And the paper discussed what the levels of coverage might be, whether or not VCOD would lift the uptake of vaccination, but also the degree of opposition and also the risk that members of staff in the care sector might give up their jobs. And on the 26th of June, could we have this, please? 000153996, page 1. You sent an email which refers indeed to the work that you've done on the flu issue for the World Health Organization prior to 2017. But at paragraph 1, you said there is essentially no evidence base for the effect of COVID vaccination of healthcare workers on the protection of patients and residents. But there is plenty of evidence that nosocomial COVID-19 is a problem in healthcare and residential care.
Yes.
Could you just elaborate on that?
Yes.
Because from a layman's perspective,
Yeah.
it would seem self-evident that if you vaccinate carers in a care home, you will reduce the risk that their
Yes.
cares, the residents, become infected.
So I'm glad you've asked me this question, because this is typical epidemiology medic speak.
Thank you. Right.
When I say there is essentially no evidence base for the effect of COVID vaccination of healthcare workers on the protection of residents, it doesn't mean that vaccinating healthcare workers doesn't protect residents. It means that no one studied it, and therefore no one has generated the evidence by which I can say there is proof that it will prevent infection. It is a perfectly reasonable supposition, as Sir Chris said this morning, that actually if you're not infected with COVID because you're being prevented from being infected with it for by some means, including vaccination, then you can't pass it on to anybody because you don't have it. So yes, it's common sense, but this is written in a very specific medical way. And I'm worrying now that it was misinterpreted by others at the time, but there is no evidence base for it.
Well, you made it absolutely plain what you meant, so that's very helpful, Professor. And indeed, the government took a view as to, well, it decided to implement a policy of VCOD in registered care homes on the basis that mandatory vaccination of care home workers would reduce transmission and would protect residents more. The issue then became, to what extent would there be opposition? To what extent would people walk away from the care sector because they didn't wish to be subject to mandatory vaccination?
Well, indeed, and all of the issues that Sir Chris very eloquently laid out this morning.
All those issues, indeed. Another topic, please, in relation to safety. In September 2020, part of the clinical trials, and I can't recollect which phase of the trials it was, but part of the clinical trials in relation to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was paused because of safety signals coming to light, emerging, concerning the possibility of a condition known as transverse myelitis, which I think is to do with the inflammation of the spinal cord. Could we have, please, 000152797, dated 11th September 2020? Obviously, the question of authorization was absolutely for the MHRA, and the question of prioritization was for the JCVI. But as you said earlier, the Office of the Chief Medical Officer plays a very important part in being made privy to information and expressing its views and giving advice. And you say, having been told that a review of safety information had been conducted and the independent data safety monitoring board set up by Oxford for the trial had met and recommended vaccination could resume, you said this: "Thank you for the update. Participant safety and indeed the safety of any vaccine are of paramount importance, and I thank the MHRA for its independent oversight." Yep. So a nod to the independence of the MHRA again. In your position as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, are you aware of any instance in relation to any of the COVID-19 UK vaccines where safety was not regarded as being of the paramount importance?
No. With vaccines, you are offering a medical intervention to someone who is generally perfectly healthy. That is a bit different to somebody who is offered a medical intervention who is at death's door because they're so ill with a particular illness. And so the risk-benefit in terms of the acceptability of safety is even higher stacked in terms of safety when you're intervening in a perfectly healthy patient. So I think what I said there is true, that safety is absolutely was paramount. What was going through my head, of course, when we got this signal, was separate to the MHRA's independent judgment about what should then happen in terms of whether the trial proceeds. But at the back of my mind is the thought that if that independent judgment is that this vaccine goes down at this point, then not me personally, but the VTF, we've just lost one of our spread bets here. And, less important than the betting is the fact that our anticipated downstream supply of, shall we say, 20 or 40 million doses, I'm making the figures up, but whatever it was, that's just gone. And we've got to compensate for that somewhere else in our other contracts.
But in the second paragraph, you make absolutely plain that the practical consequences in terms of access to vaccines was secondary to the independence of the safety review.
Yes.
Right. And over the page 2, do you refer to a number of the other steps that were taken, the bodies that are concerned in the safety process? You refer to the manufacturer's own data safety monitoring board.
Yes.
That's comprises independent external individuals. Yep. Who comprise a board which gives advice to the manufacturer. But also the CHM, is that the Commission on Human Medicines?
Yes.
Is that an independent advisory body that gives advice to ministers alongside the MHRA?
It advises the MHRA.
It advises the MHRA. And also a reference to international regulators. Do you see halfway down the page?
Yeah.
We're not aware of imminent decisions by other regulators.
No.
In truth, the safety field is extremely well populated by bodies, individuals, regulators in this country and abroad,
yes,
all focused on safety, monitoring safety, and on analysing emerging safety signals.
Yeah. And the point about international regulators is that all of these vaccine manufacturers are manufacturing for the world as much as they possibly can. Subject to affordability, of course, but they are intending that there is a global distribution. And the UK is now, particularly after having left the European Union is a very small market if in the eyes of vaccine manufacturers now. And there's no more important regulator to us than the MHRA, but actually, if you look at the FDA and the EMA, in terms of the population bases they serve, they're massively larger. So there is also this tension, if you're a vaccine manufacturer, about which regulators are interested in whatever's going on in your trial.
But it's obviously of assistance to the UK regulator, the independent MHRA, to see what other fellow and similar regulators are doing in Europe and America.
Indeed.
And they know all the time what they are doing, do they not?
Well, there's more of a separation now that we've left the European Union, but of course there was none at all when the MHRA was basically one of the members of the EMA.
Was that because we were party to the EU's Eudravigilance system
Yes.
for safety signals?
Yes, and our regulator, made a very major contribution to European regulation.
Since the end of the transition period, 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2021, do you assess that we're in a less good position in terms of understanding the data available to
Mine's a
European
lay
colleagues?
assessment, and I think you need to ask that question
All right.
of Dame June and
we
other
will.
professional regulators.
I want you to look at a particular document, please, dated the 8th of December 2020, 000153551. Professor, this is a document published on the 8th of December 2020 online, and it deals with the safety and efficacy of the chimpanzee adenoviral Oxford 1 vaccine, that is, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, AZD1222, against SARS, so coronavirus, an interim analysis of 4 randomized controlled trials.
Yeah.
So 2 points, please. One, the AstraZeneca vaccine was trialled not just in the United Kingdom, but trialled in Brazil and South Africa,
Correct.
with different participants, different ethnic and racial mix.
Very much so.
And indeed, in South Africa, the figures for black African participation as opposed to white British were, of course, massively in favour of the former.
Yes.
The second point, though, is looking at this sort of document, were these documents giving facts, figures, detail of the safety processes and the trials very much in the public domain?
Once a once a paper is published in something like the Lancet, and this is the Lancet, I believe, if it's under an open access license, the very bottom line, CC by 4.0, then it's a gold access open article. Literally any citizen on the planet with access to the internet can open and download this for free.
Right. And just if we could just be good enough to scroll through rapidly the 13 pages constituting this article, we can see that it is the detail and the scientific knowledge that is imparted by this article is at a very high level, isn't it? It's extremely detailed, it's extremely learned, and it would appear to hold nothing back.
And yet it would be a very small document compared to the actual regulatory submission that the manufacturer will have put in to the regulatory bodies, including the MHRA. This is a
part of
précis.
massive
This is a
documentation.
précis, yeah.
All right. This is just a single public article.
Yeah.
All right. In 2021, just before Easter, on the 14th of March, the UK bodies, the MHRA, the JCVI, yourself, DHSC, were alerted to an issue of whether or not the AstraZeneca vaccine was causing what's known as thromboembolic events, so blood clotting, and also associated in some cases with low platelet levels. I'm not going to ask you questions about the extreme rarity of the event and how rare it was at that stage as well. But an issue arose about whether or not, having been alerted, the MHRA and the JCVI should put out into the public domain their advice and a concluded position before the Easter bank holiday weekend. Do you recall? And the JCVI met repeatedly, the MHRA met repeatedly, and you gave a press conference, I think.
On the 7th of April.
On the 7th of April. You also attended a JCVI meeting on the 4th of May. Do you assess that although the final determined position by the MHRA and the JCVI was not formally put into the public domain until after Easter, that there was nevertheless a very significant amount of information about this thromboembolic event put into the public domain before the weekend?
I think there was information in the public domain before the weekend, and I don't think people did nothing. Well, I absolutely recall that people didn't do nothing over the Easter weekend and kind of down tools and say, look, it's kind of Good Friday, we can't do any more, and we'll knock this on the head until next week. It wasn't like that at all. It was the fact that this was going to be an extremely complex piece of messaging, that if it had gone wrong in some way, it would have undermined confidence in the whole of the UK vaccine programme, and therefore it was really important that there was time to properly assemble the right messages, factual, truthful, but correctly worded, and that enough organisations who would essentially kind of pick up the tab for this after the announcement understood how to respond and were not on the back foot.
So if the information had been put into the public domain hurriedly or in a way that caused the horses to shy and the vaccination programme to halt or to be damaged, COVID-19 would carry on killing people.
It could have
and that
been,
would be an unacceptable risk.
Yes, I don't know what the death rate per day was at that point, but it wasn't.
But
nice.
it was obviously significant.
And the other point is that the data by then were beginning to suggest, and it wasn't my job to adjudicate on this, it was the job of the JCVI and the MHRA, but the data were beginning to suggest that this was an age-related signal. And I recall that the eligible cohorts at the Easter weekend were over the age of 50 at that point. We hadn't gone down into those younger cohorts that would have been affected by any change in advice.
And in respect of whom there might be a difference in the extreme or very rarity
exactly
of a thromboembolic event.
The advice to use from JCVI and MHRA in terms of, particularly JCVI, in terms of vaccines that are suitable for the over 50s, which was where we were at on the Easter weekend, didn't change because of this. So we weren't at that really difficult point, and it could have been a lot more difficult if we had actually been in those lower age cohorts at the time when this signal emerged. So, that was just fortuitous.
The JCVI, which obviously was due to give its advice on whether or not the AstraZeneca vaccine should continue to be offered,
yes,
was obviously doing so in the context of realising that it was in fact the higher priority cohorts who were in the currency of being offered that vaccine, not very much younger people.
Yeah.
But they said that with substantial discomfort, they'd come to the decision not to release, because they didn't want to jump the gun and get it wrong, an independent public statement.
Yeah.
And in a letter, I don't think we'll bring it up because I'm not sure it's on the list, but there's a letter from Mr. Hancock to Professor Lim of JCVI on the 2nd of April, 416158. And Mr. Hancock says, obviously individuals should be fully informed of the benefits and risks in a timely manner. But the letter refers to even if the fact that even if the JCVI doesn't issue a full statement then and there, the MHRA had updated its weekly yellow card reporting. There were also published weekly reports referring to the possibility of thromboembolic events, very rarely, and letters had already been sent to all NHS medical directors and all primary care networks. So even if the JCVI had not issued a formal press statement, had the information about the occurrence of these events nevertheless been disseminated across a very wide scale already?
I think it was handled as expeditiously as it could have been in a safe and controlled way.
The mRNA vaccines,
Yes.
so Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech, it's well known, very rarely indeed, can have the side effect of causing myo and pericarditis. But importantly, they can also be caused by COVID-19.
Yes.
In April 21, news emerged in Israel of a small number of young men reporting cases of myocarditis. What did you do to try to get as much information about what was going on in Israel as possible?
So I recall that I had a contact in the British Embassy in Israel. I think it was Karen Shirkin, I can't quite remember, and that I asked her for a rapid introduction to the scientific authorities in Israel for a bit of feedback on this. And I think I also contacted, probably it was Phil Bryan at the time, at the MHRA, and said, look, I've just heard this, what have you heard? Are we awake to this? But you might need to remind me through some exhibits.
But you emailed, I think, a number of your contacts and tried to get as much contact as information as you could. And was this the position that the MHRA had already, of course, convened to look at it, as had its expert working group,
Yes.
as had the Commission on Human Medicine? And the figures showed, at least at the 12th of May, 16 reports of pericarditis and 19 of myocarditis for Pfizer. What was the context? How many, very roughly, how many doses had been given worldwide by that stage?
I just can't give you a proper answer to that, but my hazard is millions by that point. One of the things about safety signals with vaccines is that they're a bit like fog on the motorway, that you can be driving along and it looks a bit misty, but you don't yet call it foggy, you call it misty. But your passenger might well say, oh, it's a bit foggy. And there's another decision about when the fog lights go on your car and so forth. In other words, what I'm saying is that these things emerge very gradually as the numbers build up. And you have to decide when it's a signal and when it's not. And you have to also decide if the signal is likely causative or not. And that is such complex stuff. It is best left to people who do this for a living, which is the professional regulators and their pharmacovigilance arms. So my view was, make sure everyone's alert to this and then just leave it to the experts to work it through.
And did you ever see any attention falling short of the utmost importance being paid to the issue of safety signals and their investigation?
No, because I wouldn't have let it drop.
And would you say the same, in fact, in relation to the EU regulator, the EMA, of course, from whom you heard regularly, as well as, of course, the FDA in America?
Yeah.
It was taken incredibly seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much experience of the FDA, but I've worked with officers from the EMA over the years, and I have the highest regard for them, particularly in the vaccine sector.
And finally, I would like to ask you some questions, please, about therapeutics, and in particular, Evusheld. If it proves not to be possible to identify, develop and manufacture a vaccine, or if there is a vaccine, people are unable to take it, or if they do take it, unable to benefit significantly from it. In such scenarios, is it vital to have an alternative medicine available?
the very short answer to your question is yes. But I would, my lady, if it's possible, like to really try and elucidate for the inquiry the relationship between vaccines and therapeutics, because I don't think that's necessarily come across clearly enough. So at the start of a pandemic, when you have a new pathogen and you have nothing to throw at it other than public health measures, vaccines and therapeutics are both equally important, because you do not know which will succeed, and you already know that the likelihood in 2020 of getting a vaccine was relatively low. And so you have to go after both immediately. As our pandemic in 2020 evolved, by quite early in 2021, we were already steaming away with the vaccine programme, and it was becoming self-evident, let alone via the UK HSA surveillance, that vaccines were really turning the handle on this and making a material difference. And at that point, therapeutics do become less important on a population basis, but still incredibly important for people who fall through the net with serious illness and require some form of rescue. Now, into that space come the antiviral medicines, and we, of course, have deployed molnupiravir, and think we've deployed Paxlovid as well as specific antivirals.
Is that the combination?
That's the combination for
of monoclonal antibodies.
Yes. But to your point, to your wider point about phase 1 and phase 2 development, both of those medicines didn't come through those programs. They came direct from manufacturers who had it themselves or in-licensed it themselves and wanted to pursue it through their own kind of clinical trials development. But actually, when we, for example, evaluated molnupiravir in the panoramic study, which I know you've talked about, a platform study across primary care, we found that molnupiravir in a fully vaccinated population did not reduce the likelihood of hospitalisation by any significant amount. That's in very stark contrast to the manufacturer's phase 3 results, which showed a 30% reduction in hospitalisation, but that was in an unvaccinated population. And so I think that illustrates how, if the vaccine is doing the heavy lifting in a population, there is a changed emphasis on antivirals. Now, just to go on for one more second,
please,
on the therapeutic antibodies, there are two ways you can use those. One is in a patient who is already unwell and because of their immune state requires a bit of extra support, and indeed those antibodies have been used by the NHS for high-risk patients. The second way is, of course, to administer the antivirals as a prophylaxis that will last a finite but not indefinite period of time, that will need to be re-administered. And whenever you, in an individual patient, make a decision to stop using those antibodies, that patient is returned to a state of full susceptibility to the virus, unless they've acquired infection along the way and unless they've also been vaccinated. And to Sir Chris's point, our estimation of the number of people who would not be helped by vaccine has dropped very, very substantially now, as we've seen that even people who don't respond to a standard 2-dose prime do respond to successive doses and have important T-cell protection and so forth. So I feel it's been presented as a bit binary, that either you can benefit from the vaccine or if you're immunosuppressed you can't. It isn't like that. There are a great many patients with a degree of immune compromise who, in my view now, have benefited very substantially from vaccine, particularly as they're called twice yearly at the moment by the JCVI for boosters. So that's the kind of complex interaction between the two. And I hope it explains to an extent to the inquiry the emphasis on different on the acquisition of different products at different stages of the pandemic.
And does it follow, Professor, that is it your position, therefore, that there was no strategic, inappropriate prioritization of vaccines in 2020 over the pursuit of therapeutics, particularly bearing in mind that throughout 2020 there was a focus on the reprioritization of already authorized drugs, which led to dexamethasone.
Yes.
And in 2021, the development, manufacture, authorization, and then making available of molnupiravir and Paxlovid in particular.
Yes. Along with some monoclonals.
Along with some monoclonals.
Yes.
And does this second proposition also therefore follow? Is it your view that there was a lacuna, whether prophylactically or by way of treatment following infection, for the immunocompromised? A gap they were essentially left hanging, or is it your view that to a very large extent everything that was done reasonably was done in terms of trying to procure therapeutics?
I think history speaks for itself that those immunosuppressed patients can access treatment, whereas those of us who don't have those kind of conditions can't. So yes, I think so. I think the notion that was laid out before Sir Chris this morning, that what we said in February 2021 about Evershield was a kind of permanent no. That certainly wasn't the case. It was a no, not now, and not in these quantities. We didn't have any clinical trials results. The MHRA approval was later. The vaccine programme was moving at real pace. We don't have a virus that is obviously winter seasonal in the same way that influenza is, and so timing of administration would have been very tricky indeed. We also had a promised very short shelf life for any bulk manufacture, and with hindsight, we also discovered that there was going to be a potential resistance problem with the Omicron variant, though we did not know that at the time of writing the letter.
And is that reference, I'm sorry to interrupt, that reference to Omicron is a reference, is it, to the fact that at the end of the process, so by 2021, when there was an issue about, and into 22, whether by way of treatment, whether prophylactically Evusheld shall be offered to people who were infected. Omicron had changed the game, it changed the rules, because such clinical data as there was made plain that it was less effective against this variant. And secondly, I think the point would be put to you on behalf of the immunosuppressed, well, look, great risks were taken in relation to vaccines. Great advance purchase at massive cost at risk before one knew with any degree of certainty whether they would work, and certainly in advance of the majority of the clinical data becoming available. Ultimately, Evusheld was put through the rapid C19 committee process, and a decision had to be taken as to whether it was appropriate to decide to proceed with it and buy in large amounts. Why wasn't Evusheld given the same crack of the whip, the same degree of at-risk purchasing that the vaccines were?
Because it was moving at so much slower a pace. And it's, at the time at which enough data surfaced to understand what it would do, we were in a completely different phase of the pandemic by then.
Because the vaccination programme was essentially complete, because the population had thereby been immunised, and therefore transmission was lower, and it was a different ballgame.
And indeed, many of the immunosuppressed population all of them pretty much, would have been vaccinated, and a substantial majority, we now have understood, will have some degree of protection from the vaccine programme and how it is applied to them.
Thank you. My lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keith. Ms. Morris.
My lady. Professor Van Tam, good afternoon. My questions are on behalf of the COVID Adverse Reaction and Bereaved groups. And my questions are going to focus on public health communications about risk. You've touched on one example of that with Mr. Keith a moment ago, the Easter pronouncements. But I'm going to ask you in general terms, please. You said in your statement that no vaccines are without risk. So the question when offering clinical advice to the public is whether the benefits exceed the risks.
Yes.
And you said in your statement that you consider that the Chief Medical Officer's Office contributions to public messaging about vaccines adequately reflected both the risks and the benefits of vaccination.
Yes.
So my question is, would you agree that enabling an individual to make an informed decision requires providing more than just a general statement that the benefits outweigh the risk, but also specific information about those risks to allow them to make an informed, independent assessment of whether the vaccine is something that they want to undertake?
Yeah. So I want to be clear that the assessment of risk-benefit itself was done by the JCVI, not the UK Chief Medical Officers.
Understood.
It was our job to communicate it. I think there were a multitude of sources available to explain what the potential adverse events were. That communication is generally in the domain of the UK Health Security Agency, but I think we did our very best to be fair and realistic about that. And indeed, at vaccination sessions, I would say pretty much every patient I saw was given a patient information leaflet at the time of vaccination by either the vaccinator or the clerk helping the vaccinator in the booth. So I think there was a very substantial amount of opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you. Well, the inquiry may hear more evidence about patient information leaflets throughout the evidence, but you say further that in your statement that relative risks can themselves be misleading when communicated to non-experts if the effect of the size is very rare. And you said as well that that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use such statistics, but they should be put into context and therefore reducing the risk of harming public confidence in a vaccine and therefore reducing the risk of vaccine hesitancy. So it seems to be you're sort of talking about sort of the way that information is packaged and put forward in public messaging. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I don't think I want to, unless my lady you want me to go through again relative and absolute risk. I think that was very well taught this morning. I think the things you talk about are important, but I think they were very well handled.
My next question is, do you believe the messaging that you reference sufficiently empowered individuals to understand those risks in detail rather than relying on sort of general and consistent pronouncements that the benefits outweighed the risks?
So I'm a great believer in doctors treating their patients as if they were their relatives, their loved ones, because I think that way you get the very best out of doctors. And my doctors quite often get asked, well, what would you do if I were your relative? Because I think that's you hit the nail on the head there. I have been very public in communicating with the public that I told my mother that she was to have her coat on and to be ready for the first available vaccine slot that I could get her, wherever it was in the UK. As it happened, it was where she lived, but I think that's important. And I think we know from influenza vaccination that the strongest advocate of vaccination, the strongest advocate of helping a patient to understand risk and benefit is for a practitioner to say whether they themselves have been vaccinated. And we know that is very effective in terms of flu vaccine uptake. And so, that's the most important. They're the most important communication facets.
Thank you, Maidi. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Ms Mitchell, who's that way?
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. Earlier in your evidence, you mentioned controversial decisions, and it's on the issue of difficult decisions to be made during a pandemic that I'd like to ask you about. The inquiry heard last week about the MEAG, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, which was closed in October 22. The Scottish COVID bereaved suggests that a body be set up to deal with medical ethical issues, which could provide advice, for example, as what to do in a pandemic when demand for vaccinations outstrips supply, if that ever comes to pass. Is this an issue that might helpfully and workably be considered by such a body? And if so, do you think that the CMOs of each country should be part of that body?
So, first of all, the idea of ethical decisions in medicine and public health practice is definitely not new. And MEAG, to which you refer, was, as far as I understand it, and I didn't follow that committee greatly, an evolution from CAPI, which was the Committee on Ethical Aspects of Pandemic Influenza, which I remember being set up to consider ethical issues in relation to a pandemic, particularly, well, obviously a flu pandemic, but around potentially the use of very scarce resources, such as the intensive care unit, were they to be overwhelmed. Now, we never got into a position, the scenario described, of running out of vaccines, but I imagine that we would have put that back to JCVI, saying that we can't deliver what you recommend, what do we do about it? And I imagine that there would have been a discussion with MEAG at the time. So, yes, I think ethics is very important in these big public health crises, but I think the question you're asking about should such a body exist in a kind of standing way is probably one that ought to be addressed to the Department of Health and Social Care, or even to the Cabinet Office, rather than me as the DCMO, as was.
Do you... just one final question on the point of who might be involved in that body. Do you think it would be helpful if a CMO or Deputy CMO would be part of that process?
I think the expert groups need to have the right constitution of experts and lay people on them. I think there's a point about a DCMO or a CMO being present as an observer, in the same way that I was privileged to be an observer at JCVI meetings whenever I could manage it, which was most of the time. But CMOs and DCMOs in a pandemic crisis are pulled 1,000 ways each time of day, and I don't want to give you a dishonest answer that I could necessarily have prioritised those meetings had I been invited.
Thank you.
My lady, it may assist if I simply observe that, very briefly, that in the 3 witness statements of Clara Swinson from the DHS, the Department of Health and Social Care, there are references to the role of MEAG. It reported on age mortality issues, the vulnerability of those who work in frontline occupations, VCOD, uptake amongst minority communities, younger adults, wastage, passport certification, and a host of other issues. And there's a witness statement from the chair, the co-chair of MEAG, Sir Jonathan Robert Montgomery, in the written material.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keith. Professor, thank you so much for your help, all that you did obviously during the pandemic and the help that you've provided to the inquiry. I hope that you don't go near Whitehall soon when you referred to the joy of leaving Whitehall. So thank you very much for everything you've done. I think the stenographer
probably
deserves a break. So if Dame Jenny Harris will forgive me, we'll take a break now and I shall return at 4 o'clock.
All rise.
I'm sorry we've kept you waiting so long, Professor Harris. As you probably heard, we've had quite an intensive day.
Thank you. Could the witness be sworn? Thank you.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Could you give the inquiry your full name, please?
Jennifer Margaret Harries.
You are Professor Dame Jenny Harries. I will refer to you as Professor Harries, if that's okay. Thank you very much for attending today to assist the inquiry. You have kindly provided witness statements and oral evidence to the inquiry previously. In fact, you've given evidence in all three previous modules of this inquiry. In terms of Module 4, you have provided two witness statements. The first is INQ 492334. That is the corporate statement on behalf of the UK Health Security Agency, or UKHSA. And the second is INQ 474715. That's a short supplementary statement, again provided by you on behalf of the UKHSA. Is that right?
Yes.
Are those statements true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. As I say, you've given evidence to the inquiry before, so I can deal with your illustrious professional background rather briefly. But you are the Chief Executive Officer of the UKHSA.
That's correct.
Prior to taking on that role, you were one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers for England from the 15th of July 2019 to the 31st of March 2021.
Yes.
Before your appointment as DCMO, you were Regional Director for the South of England within Public Health England
Yes.
from 2013 to 2019. Alongside that, you were Interim Deputy National Medical Director for PHE from 2016 to 2017.
Yes.
And from April 2017 until you commenced the DCMO role, you also formally held the Strategic Incident Deputy Medical Director role at PHE.
That's correct.
And in terms of your training, your background is as a clinical doctor with specialist training in public health medicine.
Yes.
Could we start, please, by just establishing some things about the UK HSA? It is an executive agency of the Department for Health and Social Care. And is it right that it became fully operational from the 1st of October 2021?
That's correct.
Its role is to protect the public not only from infectious diseases, but also from external hazards such as chemical, radiological, nuclear and environmental threats.
That's correct.
You explained that UKHSA brings together expertise from several predecessor organisations, and those include PHE and the Vaccine Task Force, or VTF.
Yes, and the Joint Biosecurity Centre as well.
Your witness statement addresses the work of the VTF. The work of PHE is addressed by your colleague, Dr. Mary Ramsey, from whom we'll be hearing later in this module. But is it right that you will be addressing the lessons for the future section of Dr. Ramsey's witness statement?
That's correct. And if I could just step back to the VTF, we, as UKHSA, we only absorbed a small component of that, so it wasn't the whole of the previous functioning VTF.
And we'll look at that in some more detail as well, but that's an important clarification. Thank you. Your main Module 4 statement helpfully sets out a narrative of events in terms of the work of the VTF, and there's no need for us to rehearse all of that evidence. Instead, although it is very valuable to the inquiry, but the focus of my questions today will be in two parts. First, on some discrete issues relevant to vaccines and therapeutics, including some advice you gave as DCMO during the pandemic, and also on lessons learned and recommendations in terms of what can be drawn from the work of the VTF looking ahead to the next pandemic. So can we start, please, with the topic of vaccination as a condition of deployment, or VCOD. And in February 2021, in your role as DCMO, you were asked for your view on DHSC advice about making vaccination a condition of deployment in care homes. We can see the relevant email at INQ 153737. And this is an email from you on the issue of VCOD, 15th of February 2021. I think there was an attachment earlier on in the email setting out some sort of DHSC policy position, and this is you expressing your view. You say at the top of that page, I've been quite outspoken on the attached. I am hugely supportive of getting care homes protected, but I have seen no evidence to suggest that this policy is going to result in more benefit than harm. My personal gut feeling, agreed not a scientific parameter, is that it is hugely risky with the workforce we are dealing with in areas with the most deprivation and likely issues with attracting staff. And you go on to set out your views. And the last bullet point of that email, on that page, you say, of most significance is my concern on potential racial antagonism when such a large proportion of the workforce in critical areas are from minority ethnic backgrounds, and particularly when low rates of uptake are not being addressed in this way in doctors and nurses. And you go on, most of all, I am concerned about the impact on wider vaccine uptake and subsequent health inequalities. If COVID goes well, we could boost vaccine uptake for ethnic minorities in all communities and gain years of life now and in the future. If it goes wrong, we lose children and parents, and the communities spiral down with ever-increasing inequality. Do you think that sufficient consideration was given to the potential impact on health inequalities when it came to implementing VCOD?
So I think the position around inequalities was well understood, and what you don't see behind this is a significant amount of discussion within the Department of Health, and I wouldn't like to suggest this is the only opportunity I had to input. I think there is a point here, which is, and it applies to many things through the pandemic, that there is often a drive or a push or a feel that inevitably one has to respond quickly to something. And what I was trying to flag here was, in the midst of gloom, there was actually a potential long-term opportunity. That if, at a time when people saw vaccines, quite rightly, as something which was going to pull us out of the pandemic, that would be a positive lever for the future for other vaccination programs to start to reduce inequalities. That's a very difficult position to hold in the middle of the pressures of a pandemic. And so, although you can see that in general, I was leaning away from it, if I had a personal view, that was one of many views at the time, and there were many good logical reasons, which I also understood, for why you would want to maximally protect a care home immediately.
You're writing this in February 2021. Here we are, January 2025. In your view, did COVID go well or go wrong in terms of vaccine uptake and subsequent health inequalities?
So the short-term impact of this was that vaccination of care workers rose in the immediate time period. And one of the critical underlying factors here was, at this time, the workforce, I was thinking particularly about London, where 50% or more of the workforce in minority ethnic areas and most of the deprived areas was from minority ethnic workers. They are the bedrock of providing services. So if, as I think one of the opening statements suggested, people had perhaps taken a break rather than been enforced to have it, the whole system would have collapsed, and we would have had then risks to life potentially, because we would not have a workforce for those elderly people needing care. I think from some of the evidence that's been put forward, and it's difficult to estimate this in scientific parameters statistically, but I think what we have seen is it is the trust element behind this which goes. I actually personally think every clinician, every healthcare worker, every frontline support worker, absolutely it's their responsibility to do what they can to protect those that they care for. but I would rather see it introduced in a way which is longer term, sustainable, and based on trust and good information.
Finally, on this, did we get it right, the VCOD, for workers in this situation, or is there anything to be learned in terms of lessons for the future in the next pandemic and how we go about it?
So I think my comments here are a microcosm of what I've seen in more general programmes. So, for example, you're probably aware of the measles outbreak in Birmingham or Wolverhampton, and I was struck when I was visiting that many of the communities there, it is a long-term trusted relationship. It's not about an occupation or a transactional reaction or an ethnic background. It's about a community and individuals in it, and they need to have those long-term sustained relationships on a non-transactional basis where people understand what is important to the community as well as what we see as important to protect the population.
That can come down. Thank you very much. Next topic is prioritisation decisions of the JCVI and how those decisions are taken, which groups are prioritised. And you may be aware that the core participant group, COVID-19 Families for Justice UK, has raised concerns about whether teachers and perhaps other key workers should have been prioritised for vaccination. And indeed, the inquiry heard moving evidence last week from Helena Rossiter about her son Peter, who was a teacher, and he sadly contracted COVID-19 and passed away in August 2021. In February 2021, the Director of Public Health at Liverpool City Council contacted you about piloting a scheme which prioritised vaccination for teachers, something that would have been outside of the JCVI guidance on prioritisation. It was said that such a pilot would reflect the priority of reopening schools, keep infection rates low in schools, and build confidence among parents and school staff. And we can see your response to that idea at INQ 72914, please. And here we go. This is your email response, 25th of February 2021. Now, you were against such a pilot, and you set out in your email a number of points why. We can see that as we move down. Thank you. You say the rationale for appearing to be unhelpful in your immediate ask is because of the wider implications. And you set out your logic there as follows. The agreed prioritisation of vaccination has been to save lives. Mortality and morbidity rates among school teachers are either lower than or similar to relevant comparator occupational groups. Children themselves rarely get seriously ill. All teachers who are clinically extremely vulnerable should have been vaccinated by now. And you go on to list some further factors there. And you say, at the bottom of this email, please, a bit further down the page, quite apart, in the middle of the page there now, quite apart from this more logical discussion, such a move would inevitably open the floodgates to every other group of workers who may feel they lack confidence in the current pandemic. You give some examples. And all public-facing and essential for our current ability to maintain a relatively normal and probably all meeting a higher number of new social interactions through their workplaces than teachers. So you're talking there about the floodgates being opened. You do go on in the next paragraph to stress that having a really clear and simple rollout programme for the UK has enabled delivery of the vaccine. But you do say, whilst you will know, I am usually hugely in favour of local variations and process adaptations, this is one where I think the outcomes could be different. What did you mean when you said you were usually hugely in favour of local variations and process adaptations?
So, first of all, can I just say I did listen in detail to Mrs. Rossiter's hearing appearance, and so my condolences to her, because she will be very interested, I'm sure, in the logic that went through this. But obviously we are looking, as we've heard, at population health and the delivery of a whole country vaccination programme. The reason I put that is because my background, which you didn't get to, is actually I've spent more time as a Director of Public Health in local communities, and the starting point for where I think is in communities, not in a Whitehall office somewhere. And Matt Aston was one of my previous fellow Directors of Public Health, and I would often have Directors of Public Health emailing me to keep in contact, if you like, or if there were queries around why we were doing something or something that had been announced, if they had information, they would come to me. So it's a friendly voice, if you like, a friendly contact in CMO's office. So that's what this means here, and what Matt will know that I understand sometimes you need to use local variation to get the right impact, to reach people, as we've been speaking about, I think, a lot during the inquiry. And so what I was saying was I understood why he might be trying to do something differently, but why, unusually for me, I'm very supportive, in this case, I didn't feel that was the right approach. And quite apart from the overall logic about the epidemiology and the evidence that we had to date, two things. One is it would have been a study and it would have required ethics approval, and I didn't consider the logic would actually have given that, so that would be a no-goer. But actually, there is a very simple point here, which is the rollout of the programme, vaccination programme in the UK, was unprecedentedly quick. And actually stepping across, trying to put in variations, if Matt had gone in one direction and another Director of Public Health in another, very soon what you'd find was the whole of the programme would have been disrupted, and we would have been focusing on small groups with much lower risks of all mortality, rather than covering the whole population very rapidly in a systematic and clinically prioritised way. So again, broadly very supportive of local variation and seeing things from a community side. In this case, I didn't feel it was the right thing to do for the reasons stated.
Is an important lesson for the future here about the clarity and simplicity of the JCVI approach and how effective that was?
Yes, I think we've spoken a lot about communication, and you can never do too much communication, and there will always be a problem with it somewhere. But for something of this size, in trying to protect a whole population, that simplicity, to my mind, was a really important part of the success of the vaccine rollout.
Before we move on to VTF lesson learning, one more email, please, and it's INQ 534168. It's an email chain between Dr. Ramsey and others, including eventually you. And I'll just say this at the outset, that this is a long email chain in relation to information on the NHS website about blood clots, and Dr. Ramsey raising the concern that the information there was inaccurate and misleading, and eventually she brings it to your attention. But there's no suggestion that at any stage you were responsible for updating the advice or were responsible for the fact that it may have been misleading. So you say, or rather, Dr. Ramsey says in the email at the second half of that page, "Dear Jenny, to be aware, I have requested clearance to change NHS website, which is currently out of date, for information on clots," and this is the 2nd of April 2021. So we're now on the eve of that advice from the JCVI changing on the 7th of April. We'd heard about this critical period with Jonathan Van Tam a little earlier. This was the weekend over which there was some correspondence about how this would be communicated to the public. And Dr. Ramsey says, "Sort of me against DHSC comms, CMO in between, sub going to Secretary of State. Long story, but it was never updated after last MHRA press release because we were waiting for updated advice. Dragged on so long it was then too late. Current content links to out-of-date MHRA story with very bad advice about presenting, implying you have to have 4 days of headache rather than headache starting more than 4 days after vaccine. if we just move down the page, please, we can see that, and sorry, just go back up, please. There we go. We can see that Dr. Ramsey has put an excerpt of the MHRA advice there, and your response at the top of the page, very grateful for update. Given the various arguments that have been elaborated, nothing further to add, but keep me up to date, essentially. Now, that can come down from the screen. Thank you. Are there any lessons we can learn from this in terms of ensuring that the public is kept up to date about safety and risk? In particular, looking at that email, it seems like a lot of bodies were involved in signing off advice. You've got NHS Digital, the Secretary of State, DHSC Comms, MHRA, OCMO, all of these people having a say on how this should be coordinated. Were there too many cooks in terms of getting this message out there and making sure it was accurate?
So normally this would flow very smoothly. I don't think there's a problem. I think it's actually important for public safety in this case that there are a lot of cooks. It means, as there are Marys and me and CMO and MHRA, everybody actually trying to keep a focus on what is happening and interrogating information. So I think the fact that there are lots of eyes looking and trying to get it right is important. The critical point here was that, if I remember correctly, there were two elements. One was the actual articulation of the MHRA advice, so whether it had been, and it's surprising how a change of 2 or 3 words will give a different meaning or imply something differently to different people. And I think Dr. Ramsey was quite outspoken in her view of how that had been articulated. So that was one issue. But then it ran in, and there's no suggestion that anybody disagreed that that should be rephrased. It was in the public domain. It wasn't new. It wasn't being kept from the public. The difficulty was in trying to move that at the same time as putting new advice out, which built upon it. And I think this was the day before a bank holiday weekend. And I think there's a general consensus from everybody. Advice should go out as quickly as possible. People should always have informed consent. But in order to have properly informed consent, everybody who is part of that conversation needs to have the right evidence and information to enable an individual to have that consent. And so I think from around this time, there was and I could see in the email, which was why I didn't step in actively, there was a discussion going on across the department and with all of the communications experts, professionals, and JCVI as to what was the safest and most robust mechanism to get the information out to the public as quickly as possible. And it was agreed by consensus that it would be afterwards. It was simply, there was a risk actually in the public receiving inaccurate information or half of the information and taking action. I think also over this weekend, importantly, the advice that did come out later was going to be for the younger age group, and the people who have been vaccinated over the weekend were those in the 50 or above.
And we heard similar evidence not long ago from Jonathan Van Tam. Let's move to the vaccine task force, please, and lessons that can be learned in relation to that. On the 1st of October 2022, the VTF's functions transitioned to the UKHSA, the Office for Life Sciences, and DHSC. The VTF's Strategy and Analysis, Commercial and Project Management Office, Supply Management and Supply Readiness functions were transferred to the UKHSA. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, we've heard evidence this morning from Alexandra Jones about the manufacturing perspective in terms of vaccines and preparedness for the future. How much does UKHSA take an interest in that, and are you able to talk to us a little bit about where we are in terms of manufacturing capability?
So I think technically and logically, we do not have a remit to actually look at that. I think we should. And so the interest is very definitely there. And work which we have undertaken as we've started to come out of the COVID pandemic and looking to prepare for the future is very much based around the 100-day model. So the UK HSA holds the UK Secretariat for the 100-day model, so trying to get diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines where possible within that 100 days alongside so we're working, if you like, within the UK to try and do the same thing which we are supporting internationally. So when it comes to things like the capacity to deliver vaccines or manufacture or have substrates available for that production, to my mind, those are key components of any work we might do on surveillance to detect new pathogens, on genomics, whether we are looking at what vaccines exist already, how we're working on the international front, because the logic is if you don't have the manufacturing capacity, there's no point having done the stuff up front. So I see this as a whole continuum of which we should be directly involved. So we have done work recently, I probably not to discuss in detail here, around what vaccines and to some broad extent what capacity we have. And I think some of the comments colleagues have written in statements I would tend to agree with, which is we do not have in this country complete coverage, if you like, of all different technologies that we might require. And we certainly don't have a logic, I think, sitting behind it. I suppose from my perspective, the part that's missing is the connectivity within the Department of Health and the Department of Science and Technology, Innovation and Technology, and there is I think, a civil service clunkiness in ensuring that those facilities exist. And if I give an example, because I know it's been a topic of the inquiry, whether or not VMIC is the right thing to be available or should have been sold or whatever, actually the UK HSA wasn't consulted in any way at all. And I think what this underlies is a wider issue about government internally knowing what skills, capabilities it has at its disposal in order to link them effectively in peacetime and be ready to go in a pandemic.
I was going to ask you about that because arguably one of the great benefits of the vaccine task force was it took this global view of the vaccine journey. It was looking at what was available in terms of the market, procurement, manufacturing capability, and it also advised to a certain extent on deployment as well, limited, but it did play a role. It was that whole vaccine journey that it had a look at. And had responsibility for. It sounds like, and it's certainly taken from your statement, that has now been fragmented across departments. Is that something that needs to be fixed?
So if I step back, it was very interesting when the part of the vaccine task force that came to UK HSA, and I might say I very voluntarily and actively grabbed them for the reasons which we are talking about. They came into the UK HSA as the COVID vaccine unit, and they came with skills and approach, a way of doing things which we need to capture for the longer term. That doesn't mean what was happening originally was wrong. It's more horses for courses. We want slow, steady business as usual for some programs, and we need the alacrity of the vaccine task force to be able to go when we need it. What was very interesting was it took me quite a while. I stood back and said, what is it that the vaccine task force has done that makes it different? And try to look from the eyes of those who had, if you like, come over to UK HSA. Many of the things which they cited as part of the vaccine task force, quite rightly from their perspectives, were things which I knew were not part of the vaccine task force. They were existing parts of the system. So, for example, the work which was done at Porton Down was actually PHE laboratories, but it wasn't recognised that that was a scientific site of excellence to start with. The registry, I think, was, and I may be wrong on this one, based on a registry which existed but actually needed hauling into the 21st century. There were surveillance systems and genomic systems that were running. So I think what the vaccine task force did, there were some very specific things. One is it was contextual It did have a very, very clear mandate with a very significant budget and a very active leadership, and those were all good. The thing that really pulled it out was the connectivity with industry, with pharma and biotech. And that is the area which in UKHSA I am trying to replicate, and I can go into some of the ways that we're doing that.
Well, let's look at the relationship with industry through the lens of the cancellation of the Valneva contract. And just some background to this. September 2021, the UK decided to cancel the vaccine supply contract with Valneva. This vaccine was a whole inactivated virus vaccine technology, a well-established technology for developing effective vaccines. It was the only inactivated whole virus candidate in the VTF portfolio. And you will have seen the concerns that have been raised by a number of Module 4's witnesses in relation to the cancellation of that contract. Dame Kate Bingham describes the cancellation as inexplicable and says that it is a hallmark of the adversarial approach that was taken to industry since she left the vaccine task force. She says it sent the worst possible message to any future UK industrial investor or life sciences partner. And Dr. Clive Dix, of course, was the interim chair of the task force after Dame Kate Bingham left, is similarly critical. Now, you were not involved in this decision, but you are the UKHSA corporate witness giving evidence here at this module of the inquiry. What lessons, if any, does the UKHSA draw from the Valneva episode in terms of ensuring positive relationships with industry?
So I might take that in reverse, because it assumes that the relationships with Valneva and with industry are poor now, and I don't think that is the case. So I have read Dame Kate's statement and Clive Dix's, and the assumptions that, we have been working with Valneva directly. The Livingston factory is operational. There are vaccines for working towards chikungunya, but Japanese encephalitis, I think, being developed there. And I think if you look at the statement from the Valneva representative, I don't know if they're speaking in due course, it actually says we would work with HMG in the future. So I think objectively that is not the case. And in fact, we have, as UKHSA, have an invitation to go to Livingston factory this year, and they are part of our forum in the 100-day mission work of working with industry. They're one of our partners. So we should not be too pessimistic, I think. That signals there's a very healthy relationship with industry. The issue with the Valneva contract does flag, I think, a tension between some of the issues to do with why the task force was successful, but also why it starts to fall into difficulties when we get into routine business as usual. So if you back... I think we've said we backed lots of horses. There were 7 main contracts. We thought there was a 5 to 10% likelihood of success. Actually, if 7 of them succeed, some of them are likely to be better than others. It is important when JCVI makes its decisions that those decisions are based on using the best vaccines, the most cost-effective vaccines for the population. And unfortunately, despite all of the various stages of growing things and variants and what have you, by the time we got to the critical point, I think Valneva could not deliver against its contract. It had a contract which it had agreed and the task force had agreed. And moreover, the product was not going to be likely under any circumstance in the future, even though it was actually given a conditional authorization to be put forward as a preferred JCVI recommended vaccine. Now, I think to some extent that's inevitable if you have 7 different positive outcomes from trials. And there are 2 things that I think are important. One is, I think there's an implication in many of the statements that people don't realise that it appears that there is a focus on mRNA vaccines. I have stood up at the World Vaccine Congress in Washington and said very clearly we need to understand and keep working on the different technical modalities, because there will be horses for courses, that sometimes some will work, others won't. In this case, I think there was an assumption that those who were perhaps, it was a fairly standard vaccine platform, well used, that those who were immunosuppressed might actually have a better booster result from this. That was not what happened in practice, evidentially, so we couldn't use it for that basis. And at the end of the day, the contract had been agreed. So there was a shared risk with all of these contracts, quite wide risk taken by government. But at some point, government has a responsibility to the taxpayer, and I think that was factored in. But moreover, if the basis was actually to ensure that we onshored that sort of technology, then my view is perhaps it should have been a different sort of contract, because this was a fairly standard contract that needed to be followed through. And at the decision was taken with Minister's approval and with direct approval by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, with all the factors around employment and Scotland and the share price changes and everything else absolutely understood. So I think it was a very well considered decision, albeit clearly not one that Valneva would have wished for at the time.
Let's move now, please, to current preparedness. And again, it's only right that I air some of these concerns that have been raised about the state of the UK's preparedness. Dr. Dix expresses the view that the UK is now in a weaker position than it was prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we don't have any resilience. And Sir John Bell, in his words, he says someone needs to get a grip, and presumably it's the UK HSA that is going to be foremost in getting that grip. Is VDEC, the Vaccine Development and Evaluation Centre, an important part of gripping the situation and ensuring there is resilience? And if so, could you tell us about that, please?
It is, but it's all the systems around it as well. And I think, without sounding like I'm on a ticket to the Treasury, it is important to understand the resource which is available. So I think we are getting a grip. It's not just our responsibility either, but the parts that we can do, we are actively tackling within the budget that we have. I mean, our budget now is about 3% of what it was at the time when the Vaccine Task Force was operating and the pandemic was at its heights. So it is a very, very different context that we're working in, but equally we're not trying to respond to a pandemic at the same time. So the Vaccine Development and Evaluation Centre is sitting within a whole pathway of work that we're doing. It stems right from the opportunity to contribute to international surveillance. So I noted, for example, Professor Horby's content was suggesting we should be working, for example, with BARDA, the American research. We do. We contracted with them on an indefinite contract with indefinite quantity. So we are, I think, the only international partner who has that sort of relationship outside the US. We are working with their own data outbreak forecasting centre. We, in the UK, have contributed and are leading key parts of the new UK National Biosecurity Strategy that was published in 23. And so that surveillance data allows us then to feed into and start to predict in the same way that, and contributing directly to WHO work on the R&D, the blueprint for likely pathogens coming up. And we've done some early work, and VDEC is involved with some of this as well, on the priority pathogen family for the UK, if you like, and that includes endemic disease and AMR. And we are developing what we've called a tool, an R&D tool, and we have shared some of that. It's not quite finalised yet, but it is doing exactly what I think many of the contributors to the inquiry have said, which is to look ahead, to develop products against the priority pathogen families, and start to scan where we have vaccines or therapeutics and where there are big gaps. So the Vaccine Development and Evaluation Centre, what that is doing is contributing both to the surveillance, but it is also supporting industry. We do contracted work, but we also start to develop novel ways of looking at things. So, sorry, I've just had I've had a senior moment here. There's a chip mechanism for trying to construct different ways of looking at tissue. So rather than using animal models, looking to see how you can test products and vaccines using different models than previously. So lots of innovation work, and that centre supports trials going right through from preclinical right through to phase 1, 2 and 3, and actually was instrumental in supporting many of the trials from the Vaccine Task Force.
And maybe you can help us with this, please, because UKHSA holds the SRO responsibility for the partnership with Moderna, and this is dealt with in Dr. Ramsey's statement. The aim of that partnership is to have a manufacturing facility that will be capable of scaling up to supply up to 250 million doses of mRNA vaccine per year in the event of a future health emergency. There's also the AstraZeneca investment announced in March 2024, a planned investment of 650 million in the research, development and manufacture of vaccines in the UK. I think the plan is to have a site open in Liverpool. We heard from Alexandra Jones this morning that those two central planks of preparedness and forward-looking planning, neither of them are open yet. They're not operational. Can you help us with how VDEC, if it does, feeds into the work of these investments from industry, and how that may ensure preparedness for the UK?
I don't think we should just see VDEC as doing that. The whole organisation feeds in. So if we know what variants are coming, the VDEC, the centre is expert in looking at, for example, in the neutralisation studies, looking to see whether vaccines stay active against different variants, whether therapeutics are useful. And so it's a whole pathway of genomics, of detecting different pathogens out there, and then looking at them in detail and suggesting working with manufacturers and pharma to understand what the likely future products could be. So the Moderna strategic partnership is really interesting. You say it actually gives us, because the mRNA technology is likely to be a very rapid turnaround, probably more so than many of the previous ones, it means that instead, potentially, once up and running, we can detect earlier, we work with manufacturers, with vaccine companies, and actually turn that round. So, for example, I think it will be possible in the future, instead of trying to work out what the next flu variant is going to be in the winter, to actually be able to manufacture in that time period a much more specific vaccine for the seasonal flu, which will have higher effectiveness and actually deliver it within a very short time period. On the so Moderna has built their site at record speed. It is actually just about due to be open very shortly. It should be operating by the end of August, I think, to be confirmed with them. But one of the exciting things there is that part of that partnership, it's not just about the product, it's about aligning preparedness. So in July last year, we did a tabletop exercise with them that said, if we had this pathogen, how would it pan out in practice? What would happen? And in fact, we'd done an even more superficial one the end of the year before, looking at the new variant of swine flu that arose in Yorkshire. So it's much more than just about producing the vaccine. It's how would we connect? How would a manufacturer get the signal? All the things that the Vaccine Task Force are doing are actually starting to become business as usual. And I think another company you haven't mentioned, and it's in the public domain, so it's not commercially sensitive, is Securus. So I visited the Securus lab. So there is an advanced purchase agreement there for flu, but also a purchase of the avian flu vaccine. And again, we're working with them, I think on the 28th of next month, to work through how would we do the rapid distribution of that if it was needed? So these are all practical examples of trying to work with industry and embed both emergency preparedness and emergency response into those relationships so they are ready to go when we need them.
Professor Harris, thank you. My lady.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't think there are any questions from call participants for you. Most times we meet, you seem to be having to deal with a new outbreak of a new virus, but this time, sadly, we've got the similar viruses we've had before.
We have.
Anyway, thank you so much for your help, and appreciate the burden we place on organisations like the UKHSA. And so please thank your colleagues and the team that you have there for all the help that they've provided. Thank you very much indeed. Can't promise we won't ask you to help again. Sorry. Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please.
All rise.